Oh, good. We'd like to introduce Brian. And Brian, where do you live? I didn't get a chance to catch up on any little details about you.
I live in Susanville, California, kind of like halfway between Redding, Reno, and Chico, about an hour and a half each of those places.
Okay, great. So anyway, well, I should have him just continue and talk about his service and what he's going to talk about tonight. So we'll go ahead and enjoy the talk about the Greater Sage-Grouse. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's funny you should mention ticks. I was handling an animal this weekend and it had a tick. So I agree that's probably going to be a bad year for ticks, but at least I heard some nice sandhill cranes while I was out in my office. My name is Brian Ehler, and I work for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm the wildlife biologist assigned to Lassen County. I've worked for the department for, almost not quite 20 years, 18 years now. I've been here in Susanville for 16 in this job. Been doing sage-grouse let counts for all that time. I'm not much of a birder. Sage-grouse let counts are about as much as I get into birding outside of doing the couple of annual Christmas bird counts. But I typically need someone to go with me to identify some of the harder birds, a lot of the brown jobbers that I can't identify on my own. Before I worked for the department, I worked for the Forest Service for a couple of years doing goshawk surveys, looking for goshawk nests and proposed timber sales to clear them so that they could cut the trees. As I'm sure a lot of you know, goshawks are pretty rare. I think we found 2 in 2 summers that I did it that we didn't already know about. And then I've also done some high elevation frog surveys for the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Council quite a long time ago. And most of my wildlife experience is with big game. I spent a lot of time surveying deer and antelope and elk populations, mostly from a helicopter. I also do a lot of capture work. We just captured a couple of wolves in Siskiyou County to collar them and track their movements, and a bunch of elk in Modoc County. And then, like I said, a lot of my work I do a lot of sage-grouse let counts this time of year. I spend a lot of time on sage-grouse counting, surveying, doing research, advocating for their importance in land management decisions by the BLM. That's probably more than you need to know about me. I think I just start the presentation. Do you know how I add it or start sharing it? I'm assuming it's going to be about a 45-minute presentation on sage-grouse, a little bit of background on their biology, life history, our management regarding sage-grouse, our research efforts on sage-grouse, and then some of the legal history of their status, both nationally and at the state level. Sage-grouse exist in 11 Western states and 2 Canadian provinces, and that would include the very eastern edge of California. There are sage-grouse in Lassen County, Modoc County, which are the 2 farthest northeast counties in California, and then there are also sage-grouse in Mono County down near Bishop. On a national level, Sage-grouse are divided into what's called population management units, PMUs. The one that covers Lassen County and the eastern edge of Washoe County in Nevada is called the Buffalo Skedaddle PMU. It's named after the Buffalo Hills in Nevada and the Skedaddle Mountains in California. Yes, we have mountains called Skedaddle Mountains. Always kind of wondered why they named them that. Back in 2002, a bunch of local agencies, including the Nevada Department of Wildlife, the NRCS, UC Davis Cooperative Extension, the Bureau of Land Management, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife formed a working group to write a conservation strategy, which was finalized in 2006, mostly to prioritize habitat improvement projects and identify the most critical habitats to protect from development, with the idea of preventing the local population from being extirpated, which just means extinct at a local level. The conservation strategy recommended counting each active lek a minimum of 3 times in order to maximize the potential or the odds of counting the maximum number of birds on the lek. The more times you count it, the more likely you are to count the most birds that are there, because it does change. There's quite a bit of day and weekly variation in the number of male birds and female birds that attend the leks. Typically, the male peak attendance is in early April, but it can be in late April, it can be in early March. It can be quite variable by year and by individual lek location. And then the female peak is typically the last week of March, but again, it can go later. So that's why we try to count each lek that we know was active the previous year at least 3 and ideally 5 times each year. Sage-grouse, or sage-hen, as it used to be called commonly, is the largest native grouse in North America. Among the North American fowl-like birds, only the turkey is larger than sage-grouse. Individual birds demonstrate high site fidelity to breeding grounds, which are called leks, with birds often returning to the same lek for 2 or 3 years in a row, which is typically about as long as they live. The breeding season in northeastern California typically lasts from early March through late April. Males attempt to attract females by fanning their tail feathers, inflating air sacs to make a very distinctive popping noise that you can hear for upwards of a mile from the lek if the conditions are right, and by chasing other males. Most breeding is done by 1 or 2 dominant males, with other males called guard males surrounding the dominant males and chasing younger males from the lek center, where most of the hens are located, and by extension where most of the breeding is done. Here's an idea of what that kind of looks like. Hopefully the picture's not too blurry. You can see there's 2 males and 3 females. Three males and 3 females. The males all have their tails fanned, so you can see those spiky feathers sticking out. And the females all kind of look like little brown rocks, which makes them a lot harder to see. Hens typically nest around April 15th, but they can nest as early as late March and as late as early May. Typically, they lay 6 eggs, but I've seen as small as 3 and as many as 11 eggs in a clutch. Because hens may re-nest after a failed first attempt, some birds do not finish nesting until mid-June. A research project from 2007 through 2009 found 5 out of 28 birds re-nested after their first nest failed. Brood rearing, which is when they, after the chicks hatch, brood rearing is when they raise the chicks to independence. Is divided into early brood rearing, which is near the nest, and then late brood rearing, which typically takes place in wet meadows and springs. Early nesters, the nesting takes about 25 to 29 days, roughly a month. So early nesters start brood rearing in mid-May, about a month after April 15th, and late nesters may not finish brood rearing until April. Brood rearing typically takes about 60 days or so, is what most people keep track of in the literature. Sage-grouse eat, no surprise, a lot of sagebrush. They eat a lot of dandelions, a lot of clovers, buckwheat, yarrow. And additionally, insects are critical for the chicks to survive and for the hens before they start laying eggs. Here's some chicks for you that we captured after the hen started nesting. You can see they're pretty cute when they're first born. You have to get to them pretty fast in order to keep track of them. What happens with chicks is you will pit tag them, which is sort of like a barcode that gets injected down their backs, and that way, if you have a pit tag reader, you can identify individual birds for the rest of their lives. So a lot of our time is taken up in the spring, monitoring these birds while they're on the leks. Leks are located on patches of bare ground, surrounded by sagebrush stands, which provide cover for the nesting females. Females in good habitat typically nest within a mile or two of the lek where they were bred. Our habitat is not so nice, so we saw birds travel upwards of 10 miles to start a nest, which is pretty crazy, and it's indicative of how bad our habitat is in Northeast California. Lek locations often show pretty low variability, even after decades of people going there and counting the birds, which allows us to generally go to the same place and time year after year and find the birds. Very rarely do they move so far away that you have trouble finding them. Annually in March through early May, a lot of volunteers count males at all known active leks that were active at least once in the previous 5 years. And they do that to determine the peak number of males that are at each lek. And we use that peak number to estimate the population size. Periodically, historic leks, which are leks that have not been active for a long time, generally 10 to 20 years, are checked just to make sure they're still not active to minimize our chances of missing birds. The Bureau of Land Management also uses helicopters and contractors to look for new leks. Typically, they do this with like an infrared type technology that allows them to cover a lot of ground. And from testing it, they've been able to find the leks that we knew were there. So hopefully they're not missing the leks that we didn't know were there. In addition to the BLM using helicopters, we also have volunteers hike around these historic lek sites to determine if the birds might have moved to a new location rather than that they abandoned the lek. Leks are counted in the morning because lekking activity is usually finished by 8 a.m. with few or no birds left on the lek about an hour and a half past sunrise. The big exception to this is that under a full moon, it's pretty normal for them to lek at night, and that can affect how many birds are still lekking in the morning. So typically you don't want to do a lek count if there's been a full moon, but sometimes you just don't have the time to be picky. Volunteers arrive approximately 30 minutes before sunrise to make sure They don't miss birds that might be disturbed by coyotes or other predators. It is common to see pronghorn antelope in close proximity to leks, sometimes walking right through the middle of them. Most often, only males are counted because they are quite conspicuous, walking and or chasing each other away from the hens. As you saw in the last picture, the hens are much harder to see, especially from a distance. And unlike the males, they rarely move. Usually a spotting scope is necessary to see the females, but binoculars are more than sufficient for counting males. You can usually get within, I would say, easily a third of a mile without risking disturbing the lek. However, if you get too close, which is a common problem for people trying to get pictures, they're very easy to disturb if you get any much closer to the lek. You will definitely, once they start looking at you, it's not much longer before they're going to start flying away. Generally, it takes about a half hour to count a lek in order to get three or four good counts. When you're counting a lek, the number changes with each count. It's pretty common. The bigger the lek, the more it's going to change. And so typically I count a lek until the number stops changing. And that's usually about a half hour. That doesn't account for the time it takes to hike out to these leks, which is generally around 30 minutes to an hour, just depending on how far the lek is from a road. And the driving time, which can often be up to 3 hours if the wrong road is inaccessible due to snow. Because of the distance between leks, it's difficult to count more than one in a morning. So we rely a lot on volunteers to cover more ground, especially because the lekking season is so short. Really, it's about a month. I mean, you can find birds as early as January in dry years. This year, unfortunately, there was just way too much snow before mid-March. There was just too much snow on the ground. And you can count them as rarely as late as May, but there's a pretty large drop in the number of birds lekking after mid-April. So the value of the counts after about April 20th are pretty low. Most of the time, you're not going to see any birds. And if you do, it's only going to be a fraction of what was there earlier. The biggest challenge for our lek counters is access, as the roads are often muddy this time of year, and it's not unusual to get stuck, especially later in the morning if the lek is far away from a good road. Generally in the morning, the roads are pretty well frozen until 10, 11 o'clock. Any later than that, and they start to get muddy really fast. It's not unusual for people to get stuck in the mud. Sometimes even the person that comes out to pull you out gets stuck themselves, and you pretty much have to beg the nearest farmer to pull you both out with a tractor. Again, just some more lekking birds, just to give you an idea how much easier it is to see the males with their tails all fanned out and spiky, their big white air sacs all puffed up to make that characteristic popping noise. Even in a fairly blurry picture, the males are way more obvious than the females. Here's some historic lek data. We started counting birds back in 1953. There's something happened in the 50s where people just started caring about sage-grouse because pretty much all the states that have sage-grouse started counting them formally about 1953. You can kind of see a negative trend starting in the 90s. That's when the effort to count leks was significantly increased, which corresponded with finding a lot more birds than the previous decades because you can't find what you're not looking for. However, now that the effort has been standardized for 30 years, the numbers have declined. pretty much every year, we have a negative trend, despite doing our best to count the same number of leks each year. The numbers just keep going down, even though our effort remains pretty constant. You can see before 1990 that there was wild swings in the number of birds, and that was directly related to how many leks they got to that year and how many times those leks were counted. It ranged pretty wildly from 15 or more leks counted to 1 or 2 leks counted, which is why they standardized the effort back in the 90s. And one more time, sage-grouse lekking. You can see how distinctive they are. They're just not gonna confuse them with any other bird out there. You do not have to be a birder to identify and count sage-grouse. They don't look like anything else. So again, starting in 1953, we started recording formal counts of sage-grouse, but the effort was really inconsistent until the 90s. Since the 1950s, the annual average is 350 males counted. The highest counts, the peak for each lek, are summed together each year, and that's where we get the number. The 2022 count was only 186, the lowest count since effort was standardized in the 90s. There was a high of 27 active leks out of 32 checked in 1990, but in 2022, there was just 10 active leks and we checked 57. So I went to a lot of leks last year and didn't see birds. We're doing our best to try and find as many as we can out there, but our numbers just continue to decline. The population declines in Lassen County are consistent with declines across the species range. The latest report estimates an 80% decline of sage-grouse across their range over the last 53 years, and that they currently occupy only 56% of their historic range, which again spans 11 states and 2 Canadian provinces. So back in the 90s, in addition to trying to standardize our effort, we also tried to develop a group of leks to use as a trend. Then we chose the leks that were the most consistent. We chose from 2 hunting zones in Northeast California. There was the East Lassen zone, which is east of Highway 395, and the Central Lassen zone, which is west of Highway 395. There is also a group of leks in the north part of Lassen County that are outside the hunt zones. We chose the 7 most consistent leks in the East Lassen hunt zone and the 5 most consistent leks in the Central Lassen zone. These leks were chosen because they were the most reliable, the most likely to have birds every year. And as part of that process, we committed to checking these leks every year. Before any other lek, we make sure we check these leks. And the reason that we chose these leks in the hunt zones was we wanted to have the best data possible in any population that we were hunting, just to make sure that we weren't over harvesting these birds. However, the counts were so low after a large fire in 2012 that the department, CDFW, adopted a quota of zero for both hunt zones starting in 2013. And we have not issued any hunting permits since in Northeast California. And in 2017, the Fish and Game Commission adopted quotas of 0 for all sage-grouse hunting zones due to declining population estimates. And this closure remains in effect. So what that means is that the other 2 hunting zones in Mono County, the North and South Mono County hunt zones were also had their quota set to 0, the same as the hunt zones in Northeast California. So there's effectively no hunting of sage-grouse in California. And our population trends being the way they are, it's unlikely that we'll probably hunt sage-grouse in California ever again. And this is just one last boring graph just to demonstrate just how steep the peak or how steep the decline has been over the last few years. Since 2016, the trend is really is pretty bad for sage grouse in Lassen County. Here's just a idea of where sage grouse are and where they used to be. Their range has contracted significantly in California, just like it has across the rest of the West. And just to give you an idea of why sage grouse populations are declining, both nationally across the range and locally in California, specifically Northeast California. The research that we've done in Northeast California has determined that our habitat is similar to habitat in other states where the sage grouse populations went extinct. So that's a pretty bad sign for the probability of our sage grouse in Northeast California persisting. Some of the threats that are common across the Great Basin, which would include California and Eastern Oregon and Nevada, are invasive grasses, specifically non-native grasses, cheatgrass and medusa head, which displace native perennial grasses necessary for hens to conceal their nests from predators. So what we look at when we're quantifying sage grouse habitat is we're looking at the resistance to annual grass invasion and the resilience to disturbance. And we found across their range that grouse populations increase much faster and recover much faster in habitat with high resistance and high resilience. Another major threat in our part of the world for sage grouse is the expansion of juniper in response to the suppression of wildfires. Fire is also a major threat for sage grouse. The fire frequency has increased dramatically due to the positive feedback loop from invasive grasses. Specifically in Lassen County in 2012, the rush fire burned 315,000 acres of primarily sage grouse habitat in the Buffalo Skedaddle PMU, 265,000 in Lassen County, and the rest in Washoe County in Nevada. Another major threat is energy development. Specifically in our part of the world, the main attraction for energy companies is wind energy. And then also a lot of new power lines for projects that need to transport power to Nevada and other parts of California from Oregon, run right through our sage grouse habitat. Feral horses, overgrazing meadows, springs, and riparian habitats, which are necessary for hens to feed their chicks. Grazing and trampling is the most common reason given when these habitats are not meeting BLM standards. And then lastly, the conversion to agricultural land is also a pretty common threat to sage grouse. So cheatgrass and medusa head are invasive grasses that were originally native to Asia. They were first introduced to North America by grazing livestock and quickly spread as they displaced native species like blue bunch wheatgrass, Idaho fescue, and Great Basin wild rye. They are also significantly less resilient to wildfire, so they burn much easier, allowing fires to spread quickly and farther. And because they are annual grasses, they emerge after wildfires first and take over sites before the native perennial grasses and forbs can even germinate. Pinyon juniper expansion has eliminated sage grouse habitat throughout the West, causing habitat fragmentation and the abandonment of leks on the periphery of sage grouse range, specifically here in western Lassen and Modoc counties. Historically important sage grouse areas have also been converted to agricultural land, which is correlated with significant declines in the leks found in these areas. So the location of the leks I'm monitoring are in eastern Lassen County, which is basically northeast of Susanville. With pretty much all those leks are east of Highway 139, and then majority of those are even further east of 395, which is the major highway going from Reno to Susanville and from Susanville to Alturas in Modoc County. Hunting in other states, I think almost all the other states that have sage-grouse have hunting. There are exceptions. I don't think they have nearly enough birds to hunt in Washington, but Nevada and Oregon, our neighboring populations, are still have a lot more sage-grouse habitat to lose than we do because we're on the periphery of their range, whereas Oregon goes a lot further east than California does. And obviously Nevada is entirely east of California. So they still have a lot more habitat and enough birds to hunt in some of their areas, but even Nevada has trouble maintaining hunts in some of their areas that have burned. Barbed wire fences, yes. So I think in all states there's an effort to put tags on fences so grouse can see them. Basically, the BLM is required to mark fences within, I want to say, 1.5 miles, something like that, of active leks. And that's because the birds are most likely to fly into a fence when they're going to a lek, because that's when they're flying pretty low to land at the lek, and they're doing it in the dark. And so, yes, through a collaboration with BLM and the NRCS, we have marked, I think, every fence within 1.5 miles of a known active lek. And typically the policy is to not put up new fences within that distance of a lek, so that they don't have to be marked, and so that we can minimize the amount of grouse that fly into fences in the dark while they're trying to get to their lekking habitat. Typically they roost when they're lekking fairly close to the lek, but they can fly in as far as 1 mile or 2 if they choose to roost that far away. And so there really is a danger of them hitting a fence if it's close to a lek, because they are flying pretty low. So I'll get into since the last question was about their legal status, I guess I'll get into that now. I wasn't really expecting to answer questions too detailed about the Trump administration. The history of sage-grouse is pretty political because they are so widespread and found on lands that are pretty important to people for grazing and for mining and for energy development. What is the concept of allowing hunting near threatened birds that are declining so fast? So so in terms of, if you're asking about Oregon and Nevada, we have no control over, how they decide to use their resources. We can't, I guess we could ask them nicely not to hunt their birds. I don't believe Nevada is hunting their birds near our birds. So I don't think that's a big issue. I'm not as familiar with Oregon because it's a little bit further away. It's a whole county away from me. But generally, we avoid hunting any kind of birds that are declining so fast that are threatened. But we have no control outside of California. We just don't have any authority in other states. So again, this gets into their legal status, the last two questions. So again, because of the political nature of the process, It's fraught with lawsuits. In 2005, after three different parties petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list greater sage-grouse as endangered. In 2005, the service determined that those petitions were not warranted, that the sage-grouse did not need protection under the Endangered Species Act, the ESA. And of course, it was challenged in the court. And so in 2007, a court ruling directed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to reevaluate this determination. And so in 2010, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that listing greater sage-grouse is warranted, but precluded by higher priority listing actions. Basically, there was too many species that were more threatened that needed time. That's basically what that means. They just did not have the timing and the staff to list sage-grouse. In 2015, after a 5-year status review, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that the greater sage-grouse did not warrant protection under the Endangered Species Act. What's most commonly cited for that is that federal land management agencies, the BLM and the Forest Service, anywhere where there were sage-grouse on their lands, modified, or I guess amended is the right word, amended their resource management plans, which basically dictates what they can do, where they can do it, when they can do it, to increase the protection for sage-grouse, regulatory protection for sage-grouse. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service determined that increased protection in these resource management plans by BLM and Forest Service was adequate to protect the sage-grouse, so that they no longer warranted protection under the ESA. Again, that was immediately challenged, and it was determined that there would be a 2020 status review to determine if they needed to be listed again. As far as I know, that 2020 review has not been finalized. I suspect probably because of impacts from COVID. And to answer the question, your question about sage-grouse protections, there is a separate, distinct population of sage-grouse that's genetically distinct from all the other sage-grouse, including our sage-grouse in Northeast California, and it's called the bi-state distinct population segment. And that population did get listed as endangered, separate from the rest of the range, which is what you're talking about with the rollback of protections. There was quite an effort, a local effort between the government agencies and private landowners in Mono County, where the bi-state population is located in both California and Nevada, to basically increase the protections more than they would have been given if they had been listed, with the idea that people did not want to list them, especially the landowners, both public and private. And that's what you're talking about in terms of like them losing their protection, because they were proposed to be listed, and then the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to pull that listing and to not propose them to be listed, with the idea that they could get more habitat conserved through private money than they could through listing them. That was challenged in 2022, and it's not my area, so I don't keep too close a watch on the bi-state, but I believe the court directed the service to list them again. So I think hopefully I answered your question about what happened with them losing the protection and then gaining the protection again. In 2022, there was the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the associated statewide Fish and Game Commission was petitioned to list sage-grouse statewide under the California Endangered Species Act. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reviews petitions under the Endangered Species Act, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife reviews petitions under the California Endangered Species Act. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decides whether to list a species under the ESA, while the California Department of Fish and Wildlife recommends whether to list or not list to the Fish and Game Commission. The Fish and Game Commission takes the department's recommendation and then votes on it. Sometimes they take our recommendation and sometimes they vote against it. An example I use a lot locally, the department, CDFW, recommended to not list wolves under CISA, but the Fish and Game Commission voted to list them in spite of our recommendation. Hopefully that answered a lot of your questions. Currently, sage-grouse in Northeast California have no special status. We don't hunt them because their population has been declining and appears under threat from a lot of different habitat changes, but technically they don't actually have any legal status, any special status. There we go. Here's a picture of a sage-grouse. That's a standard part of research projects on sage-grouse. This is a radio transmitter necklace that is being tightened around that bird's neck, that hen female's neck. So locally, we've had a number of research projects. Recently, well, I guess not so recently, now that I'm getting kind of old, the University of Idaho had a graduate student do her PhD work on sage-grouse in Lassen County, and she captured 69 birds from 2007 through 2009 to track them with the radio transmitters I just showed you. And then the USGS started marking birds in 2014, and they have marked up to 2022 188 birds with radio necklaces and 28 birds with GPS transmitters in Lassen County. And this is to monitor the impacts from the 2012 brush fire and compare current trends in demography and habitat to the study from 2007 through 2009. The USGS found that females unfortunately continue to nest in burned areas that are now unsuitable for nesting because the loss of vegetation cover increased the risk of predation on the nests. Monitoring females in consecutive years has showed females often nest in the same area, especially if the previous nest was successful. And burned habitats just do not provide suitable nesting cover, even 10 years after the brush fire in 2012. What we need that does not exist very often, in very much quantity anymore, is 15 to 25% sage-grouse cover, at least 10% forb cover, and at least 15% perennial grass cover that's at least 18 centimeters tall. So when we're capturing birds, I don't know if I can see your questions anymore. Oh, okay. When we're capturing birds for research, we're doing it at night using spotlights to focus their attention and essentially confuse them so that they stare at the light and don't see us. And then we blare loud static to hide the noise of our feet while we're walking up to them. And when the person with the net is close enough while staying behind the spotlighter so that their shadow doesn't get cast by the spotlight, they lay the net gently over the bird, and this is to avoid any injury to the head while the bird is being netted. And then the radio transmitter necklace is fitted around the throat, obviously not too tight because we don't want them to choke. Additionally, they have a leg band, which is just a metal ring that's cramped around a leg with a unique number, so that if something happens to the transmitter, and they usually die within 2 or 3 years, the battery just doesn't last longer than that. We can still identify the birds with the leg band if they're recaught. Again, also, while we are handling the birds, we take blood from them by overclipping a toenail. And this is for genetic and disease testing. Specifically, in our part of the world, we're most concerned about the West Nile virus that can be carried by horses, and is pretty has a high mortality rate with sage-grouse. Genetic testing from this blood has showed that our local population in Lassen County is not isolated from the neighboring populations in Nevada and Oregon. Genetic testing also indicated that females seem to be the dispersing sex, whereas the males tend to use the same leks as their parents. Radio transmitters can generally be detected about a mile away on the ground. So regularly we schedule telemetry flights in a small fixed wing aircraft with receivers mounted under the wings. And that's just to give a starting point for birds that can't be found while walking or driving on the ground. And I can tell you that it's not a lot of fun sitting in a small cramped airplane with a radio static blaring in your ear while you're listening for faint little short beeps. Females are preferred for capture because we can use them to estimate nest success, which is how many females hatch chicks, generally about 50% in our studies, but significantly less since the 2012 brush fire. We also can estimate brood success, which is how many successful nesting birds were able to recruit at least one chick into the fall population, about 60 days. Radio march birds are located 1 to 3 times per week to determine when and where they nest and where they are brooding. To determine how many birds nested, which is generally around 97 to 100% of birds at least attempt to nest, but only about 50% of them are generally successful, which means only about 50% of the birds are able to have a brood, which is just when the chicks hatch from the eggs. It takes about 60 or so days for the chicks to get raised to independence. That's what we call brooding. How do you feel that green energy, solar and wind, could be constructed differently than it is now for the welfare of sage-grouse? Is fossil fuel extraction a bigger problem than green energy development? Fossil fuel extraction and mining are both significant factors in different parts of the world, like Wyoming, for example, with fracking. I would say that you could probably make a case that fossil fuel extraction is certainly a bigger problem than green energy development in some parts of sage-grouse range where they are doing fossil fuel extraction. We're not doing fossil fuel extraction here in California, but in Nevada, mining is a big issue. Certainly, it's probably bigger than green energy. Mining is it's a silver state. Mining is a big deal in Nevada, and it certainly is a problem. It definitely impacts a lot of good sage-grouse habitat in Nevada. In terms of California, if you're asking me, just my part of the little world, none of these really are a problem so far. We don't have any green energy projects in Lassen County. The biggest threat, though, is the development of wind energy. We have some good spots for wind energy, and unfortunately, they're in sage-grouse habitat. And unfortunately, wind Windmills are pretty tall, and sage-grouse are notorious for abandoning leks when there are tall structures around. And obviously, we would like the power, the energy lines to be run underground in these developments, but there's no guarantee. And so more power lines is bad. Sage-grouse tend to abandon leks that are close to power lines because they provide great habitat, as I'm sure all of you know, for ravens, which are great sage-grouse predators, in addition to red-tailed hawks and all kinds of raptors. So for sure, we're pretty nervous about wind energy in this part of the world. We've had a couple of projects get proposed that fortunately did not go through, but there's always that potential looming kind of over our shoulders that, you know, some of our last great leks could be negatively impacted pretty severely by development of wind energy. And it's not just that, you know, it's not necessarily the type of energy that's the problem. It's all the infrastructure that comes with it, the roads, the truck traffic, the power lines, the noise. It all contributes. It's kind of I wouldn't really say that one is, you know, necessarily worse than the other. They're all kind of bad in the wrong spot for sage-grouse. So basically, we're tracking these birds to come up with all kinds of important metrics to determine how healthy their population is. Nesting success is really important. Brood rearing success is really important as well. And also by tracking where these birds nest and brood, we can determine through various research projects what habitat characteristics are important for successful nests and broods. So in terms of like making new habitat, it tells us what we should be making. And it also identifies the habitats that are most vulnerable, that are in most need of conservation and protection from development, which is critical for when we're commenting on development projects on both public and private land, trying to steer it away from where it's going to have the most negative impact. As we already kind of discussed, habitat characteristics for nests include the grass height and shrub cover. Those are the two most important things to look for. And then adult females are much more likely to be successful nesters than yearling hens that are nesting. And then the GPS transmitters are far superior to radio transmitters. In order to know where a bird with a radio transmitter is, you have to hear the bird, which means you have to be within a mile of it to hear it, and which means you have to kind of know where it was the last time, so you have a good place to start. The GPS transmitters are just all constantly taking locations automatically and storing them in the transmitter or transmitting them through satellites. And so you can get so much more data, exponentially more data with the GPS transmitters. You can program to take a waypoint every hour, every 5 hours. It's really up to you and how long you want the battery life to last. If you have a transmitter automatically taking the bird's location every hour, you can pretty much see exactly how and where it's traveling when it's migrating between different seasonal habitats. And that really helps with identifying important migration corridors that also need to be protected from development and land use practices that can be harmful to sage-grouse. Unfortunately, these GPS collars, GPS backpacks rather, on a bird, on a mammal, on a lion or a wolf or a deer, it's a collar that goes around the neck. On a bird, they're too small, so it's a backpack that gets glued to their back. But because they require solar power, because they're so small, they just have to have solar power. There's just really no way around it. in order to preserve the battery life to be long enough. That solar panel is a little bit shiny, and even if you kind of gray it out with paint, it still increases the predation risk. It just makes the bird far more vulnerable to predation, which is why we still have to use a lot more radio transmitters in animals this size, whereas with larger animals, we've transitioned to just completely, we're just using GPS technology because it's so much better. With a collar on a deer or a lion or a wolf, I can just go on my computer on the internet and just see everywhere it's been. I don't even have to take the collar up again. It just automatically does it through the web, through satellites. But unfortunately, the birds are just too small. The technology is just not small enough yet where we can reduce the predation risk with GPS collars or GPS backpacks. I'm definitely so for wild horses, it's pretty bad in a specific habitat type. What we have identified in the past as the most imperiled habitat is brood rearing habitat. That's where there seems to be a bottleneck, specifically in Lassen County. They're just, even before the 2012 brush fire, there just wasn't enough brood rearing habitat, and that's unfortunately where wild horses tend to concentrate because there's water there, and so they do tend to just graze these places down and trample the springs until the water just gets to the point where it's not even flowing anymore, and so they really are a pretty serious problem for sage grouse and pretty much all wildlife that use those kind of watering areas. In terms of springs, for deer, for antelope, for pretty much any kind of animal that does not get most of its water from its food, which, very few animals are getting all of their water from their food in the summertime because it's just so dry. It is pretty serious, the damage that wild horses are causing. And I think you can make a pretty good case that they're contributing a fair share to sage-grouse declines. On to conservation. I think I'm running out of time, and at the end of my talk, we're going to talk about some of the conservation efforts we're trying to do in order to try and slow down the decline, maybe even reverse it. This is a translocation effort at the Clear Lake National Wildlife Refuge, which is in Modoc County, just south of the Oregon border. And these are a bunch of volunteers releasing birds that were caught on in areas where the populations are much more robust to try and augment a population that's not doing so well. So for conservation, a lot of our efforts are focused on thinning junipers to provide nesting habitat near leks. If there's enough junipers in the lek, the birds will stop using them completely. If there's a lot of junipers near the lek, the birds have a hard time finding a place to nest, and that causes them to go further and further to nest. And that distance has an effect on how likely they are to successfully nest. Also, we're pretty focused on seeding these burned areas to restore the sagebrush and perennial grasses that burned. And then with regard to horses, because they are such a problem, we are pretty focused on gathering feral horses when they're significantly above their authorized numbers. On BLM land, on all public land that has wild horses, feral horses, they are organized into herd management areas on those public lands, and each herd management area has a set appropriate management level, which is generally a range, like a minimum to a maximum. But because there's so many horses, they're pretty much always above their maximum level. We're also pretty focused on using herbicides to control invasive annual grasses, and then the aforementioned translocations in the previous picture. Because cheatgrass and Medusa head respond so quickly following fire, It's generally necessary to seed burnt areas that are below 5,000 feet in elevation in order to have a chance to restore native vegetation. Additionally, if you aren't able to seed before the spring following the fire, you will likely need to control cheatgrass and legionnaires with herbicides in order for the seeds you're planting to even germinate. Unfortunately, in California, we are unable to use many of the herbicides that work on these exotic grasses because California has its own equivalent of the EPA, which means double the testing and double the expense. So a lot of companies just don't bother getting approved in California. Also, and further bad news, the BLM is unable to gather feral horses very often. So their populations are often double the maximum authorized number. This is due to significant funding shortfalls as the BLM has to pay to feed these gathered horses for the rest of their lives, and they can live for 10, 15 years in captivity. So it's pretty expensive. And then the translocations at the Clear Lake National Wildlife Refuge were done using birds captured at the Sheldon National Wildlife Refuge in Nevada and the Hart Mountain National Antelope Range in Oregon. The population on the single remaining lek on the Clear Lake National Wildlife Refuge got so low, it was thought to no longer be viable. So CDFW and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service agreed to supplement the lek with birds that were caught in larger, more stable populations, which has resulted in increased lek counts. But unfortunately, and also the Forest Service has cut down a lot of juniper around Clear Lake. But unfortunately, in order for us to maintain those higher lek counts, we have found that we have to just continually translocate birds to supplement the lekking population. So it works, but it's sort of like a continuing situation. Yes, they're definitely still allowing them to breed. So they are working with some new contraceptives, chemical contraceptives. They're working to try and come up with contraceptives that will work for a longer period of time. A lot of the ones that they have used in the past only work for a year or two, and then you gotta reapply the contraceptive. And that's obviously hard to do with any kind of wild animal. They really can only do it when they're in the corrals. And so they are working on trying to use better contraceptives that will prevent the mares from getting pregnant for longer periods of time. But it's an emerging science. There are promising signs, but it's far from a done deal. But there is hope that these contraceptives will be able to prevent a significant portion of the mares from getting pregnant for years at a time. But at this point, it's just in the research phase. So unfortunately, we're just kind of stuck with just so many horses out there that it's really sad. A lot of the horses that come in are in pretty bad shape because there's just so darn many of them out there. But that is the future, as we're hoping that these contraceptives will prevent their populations from basically doubling every couple of years, which is where we're at. They have no natural predators. Sometimes the mountain lions will take the babies, the foals, but it's certainly not a common occurrence. And so there's just a lot of horses out there, and we're just kind of waiting to see if we'll be able to do something with contraceptives in the future that will slow down their population growth, because they grow really quickly. Within 5 years, you're you're pretty much back to almost where you started. It's really that quick. And so these gathers are really expensive. You have to pay for the gathered horses for the rest of their lives. It's just not economically feasible to keep these horse populations at their identified management limit. And so we're really pinning our hopes on birth control being the way to keep their population from growing so fast, because they really do just grow so fast. And that's the last question, and that's the last of my notes. So I don't know if I should just stop sharing my screen, and maybe people could ask questions on video now. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Ryan, well, there's been great questions in chat. Let's see if anybody in the audience has a question.
Yeah, I do, but it's not related to this topic. I was curious about the wolves. When you were talking about the wolves, when you were putting the collars on them, just wondering how the wolves are doing.
Sure. I'm far from the expert on wolves. We have a guy who's our wolf coordinator, who does all the monitoring, does all the capturing. He's the lead for everything. The rest of us just sort of help out because we're local. And it's kind of fun to call her a wolf. I'm not going to lie. It's definitely fun. In terms of how they're doing, we have three, what I would call packs right now. We have the Whaleback pack, which is in Siskiyou County around, surprise, surprise, Whaleback Mountain. And then we have the Lassen pack, which ranges as far north as the Eagle Lake area and as far south as Taylorsville, as Indian Valley near Taylorsville, near Quincy and Plumas County. Typically, that pack winters in Plumas County, where the deer winter, and follows them up to Lassen County in the summer, where the deer summer. And then the third pack that we have is I don't even know if I think it's called the Beckworth pack. And it's basically in Sierra Valley. There's really no landmarks in Sierra Valley. It's pretty unpopulated, Sierra County. We found that pack because it killed a cow, and we took DNA samples and they came back as wolf, including a wolf that had dispersed from the Lassen pack. Wow. So basically, we estimate there to be roughly 3 wolves for sure, we think, in the Beckworth pack in Sierra County, based on DNA primarily from saliva and bite wounds and from scat at depredation sites. You can get DNA from both those samples. It's kind of gross, but when you poop, you break off some of your skin cells. And if the poop is fresh enough, you can get DNA from those skin cells. But it has to be pretty fresh. After a couple days to a week, you're not there. It's basically worthless. In terms of the Lassen pack, which was the Beckworth pack, I think we identified, I want to say in 2021, I think last year is when they identified it. It could have been 2020, don't quote me, but it was 2020 or 2021. The Lassen pack was first identified in 2016 from public sightings. We put up cameras, and sure enough, we got wolves where we were told that they were. And so we started collecting DNA samples where we were getting pictures of wolves and tested those DNA samples in 2016. And sure enough, they came back wolf. And so we started trying to trap wolves in 2016 in Lassen County. We were not successful until 2017. We were able to capture the breeding female in the Lassen pack in 2017, and that's where pretty much all of our data comes from. We were able to use that tracking collar to find its den site, and from there we were able to identify the pups using cameras and taking scat samples. We were able to get DNA samples for all the wolves in the Lassen pack in terms of their pups. So we've been able to keep track of how many pups they have each year. The Lassen pack has replaced both its breeding male and its breeding female. The breeding male originally disappeared first, and a new male came in and bred the original breeding female as well as one of her daughters because he wasn't related to her, which is pretty common with wolves when the breeders are replaced. And then eventually the mom, the original female, disappeared as well. So now we have two completely different breeders for the Lassen pack. Using cameras and DNA, we generally estimate that pack to be around 8. It's hard to keep track in the wintertime because the primary way we count the pack is through cameras. And they will all follow each other in a line, and you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, there's 11 wolves in this pack. The last camera picture we got from the Lassen pack was in the fall before it started snowing, and I think we got 8 on the camera. So that's the basis of our number for Lassen. I think for Siskiyou County, the whale backpack, that's outside of my area. I'm not involved in it, but I think they're around 5 is I think the estimate right now. And we did get, we collared 2 wolves in that pack on Friday and got DNA from them, and they have GPS collars on them to track their movements. Additionally, 3 of the whaleback wolves came to Lassen County and killed a cow. And so we got DNA samples from them, and we have a record of all the DNA samples of all the wolves that we've either caught or got samples from SCAT. And so we're able to say that at least 3 wolves from the Siskiyou pack were alive on March 15th when they came into Lassen County and killed a heifer. But I think our estimate for that is like 5. The Lassen pack has been pretty stable. It's had 4 or 5 pups every year. It's bred every year. It's had a den every year. I would say objectively, the Lassen pack is doing pretty well. We collared a wolf pup in the Lassen pack that ended up dispersing into Oregon. I just started a pack up in Oregon, and then again, like I said, one of the other pups ended up basically starting a pack in Sierra County. So that pack is doing pretty well. The Siskiyou County pack, the whaleback pack, seems to be doing pretty well too. They're killing a lot of cows. They've killed like 29 cows since September. So there's obviously enough wolves there to kill cows. The only wolf pack we really don't know much about is Beckworth. We've never been able to trap them. We've never been able to collar them. We don't know much about them. We didn't get them on cameras this year, so we really don't know what's happening. Someone did get a wolf on a camera on Highway 395 as part of a monitoring project to look at where deer are crossing the highway and getting hit, where we need to work with Caltrans to put a crossing structure for deer. One of their cameras ended up getting a wolf camera, and it's probably one of the Beckworth wolves, but without DNA, it's impossible to know. But I would say overall, wolves are doing pretty well in California, and they continue to disperse from Oregon. Unless the wolf has a collar on it, we're not going to know if it's coming into California from Oregon. But just based on the number of collared wolves that are coming in from Oregon, there are probably quite a bit more that are uncolored that are coming in from Oregon, including the wolf that started the whaleback pack, and the wolf. Some of the wolves that are breeding in the Lassen pack are originally from Oregon. Hopefully, that answered your question. I don't probably kind of rambled there, but
yeah, that's great. And it seems to all of us that you're so knowledgeable about a lot of the animals up in your area. Maybe we'll have you back for. What do you have, a bobcat in the picture behind you? Is that a bobcat?
A few years ago, the legislature directed us to try and come up with a bobcat population estimate because we've been hunting bobcats for a very long time, and pretty, without anyone really tracking, how many we were killing, how many were out there. So basically, they closed the bobcat season until we could come up with a population estimate. So we did a lot of camera work, and we did a lot of SCAT work to come up with a minimum population for the state.
Wow. Well, anyway, I think we're wrapping it up. I'm not sure if anybody has any more questions.
I think Dawn has her hand raised.
Okay. Dawn? you
Hi
wanna-
there. Hi.
Hi.
Oh my
Dawn.
gosh. Hi there. What a
Hi.
very interesting presentation. I can't believe, especially with the questions, how much conversation is brought up with wolves and bobcats and grouse as well. But I am kind of saddened about the grouse story. And I just wonder, is there anything that we can do individually and or as a group at like Audubon to make some difference to help the grouse? Because it sounds like there's so much that conflicts with grouse population health. Can you give us some positive something we could do on the way out?
There is some signs of hope for the California side of the border. Like I kind of mentioned, other states have been using herbicides for a long time to control these annual grasses. And California is working on a new pesticide that has a lot of promise for controlling cheatgrass and medusa head, and that potentially will be usable in California. The last kind of hurdle is that it has to get approved on BLM land for any area where livestock graze, and make sure it's safe for cows and sheep. But there is some signs of hope that we might be able to start restoring a lot of these sage-grouse habitats. It's really expensive, but it's nice to have the option. In terms of what you guys can do, I mean, I'm always looking for people who want to do sage-grouse counts. I think you guys go to the Safer Lek annually.
Yeah.
I know Matt Forrester, I think, kind of who I do Christmas bird counts with. He's out of Chico, and I think he leads groups annually to do lek counts at Schaefer, which is great because it's one lek that I don't have to count if enough people go in the spring. And honestly, if someone could help me out with eBird, that'd be great, because I don't know how to use that stuff because I'm not a birder. But I've heard that there's a lot of data on eBird. If someone wanted to help me get that data off eBird and into like a spreadsheet or something that's easy for someone like me to use, that'd be great. But honestly, anyone that likes to hike and likes to bird, if you wanted to come up for a day, more than a day, and just hike around some areas, if you have a GPS or if I can give you a map, you can even go with you. If you have the time to just kind of hike around for a morning and just areas, I'm pretty focused on areas that I know that there are grouse. I can barely, even with all the volunteers, I can barely get to all the leks that I need to get to that I know have birds. So if anyone wanted to like come up and just hike around the desert for a morning and look for birds that I don't know about, I mean, that would be fantastic. It would be more help than honestly you can probably understand, because that's my biggest worry, is that there are birds out there that I don't know about, and we're trying to get them through the air because we can cover a lot more ground with an airplane or with a helicopter, but it's not as good as someone walking around on the ground. In the past, I've had some employees volunteer their time to go out and do it, but that's not really an option anymore. They're gone. There are tough financial times for everyone, even the government. So if someone wanted to do that, that's what I would love. Even if it's just a day, it'd be a huge help. You can cover a lot of ground in a day. Most of these. Go ahead.
Do we have your email or contact information?
I think Mary does. I can give you my phone number right now if you want it. If anyone wants to write it down, let me know if you got. Oh yeah. Hold
Mary,
on.
you can put it in chat.
That's smart. Yeah. Okay.
So,
And regarding eBird,
Yeah.
you might be able to hit up Steve. Do you know Steve Stump in that
I
area?
do know Steve. Yeah, he's a buddy of mine too.
So I think he knows eBird pretty well, and so does Matt Forster.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my other offer definitely stands. If you have any interest in hiking around the desert, feel free to bother me anytime.
Are we gonna see you, Dawn, up here?
And not anytime really soon, but I do hope to come up, in the this year sometime.
Oh, okay. So if we go up to do some counts, maybe we'll give you a jingle. Maybe you'll.
That could entice me.
Okay.
For sure.
Another big help is just educating the public. I mean, I live in a small little town in the middle of nowhere. My exposure is pretty low. Just educating your friends and other members of your Audubon group about the dangers of sage-grouse. I feel like people kind of know, but I don't know. I'm kind of in the middle of the forest. It's hard to see the trees sometimes. Just educating your friends about all the dangers they face. They're kind of up against the wall, and the more people that know about it, the more likely it is that they'll get more resources and more protection.
Well, we're sure glad you were our speaker tonight. I think you did give a lot of that information we have had many people join in and listen to your talk. So let's just hope the other Western states stop the hunting of the sage-grouse, because they can see the decline that's happening in California. So, I mean, that's what I'm hoping for. So,
well, yeah, the decline is range wide. They just had more to start out with because we're just at the very periphery of the range, and so we always had a small number to start with. But yeah, at some point, it's going to get to that. It's going to get to where probably no one's hunting sage-grouse. They just have a lot further to go than we did. We had a much shorter trip to the bottom.
Well, thank
And
you. Go ahead.
I'm just going to say I've seen, because I worked in Wyoming for a long time, and I've seen the horse impact and the barbed wire fence impact and the cattle grazing impact. So there is a lot more than just the hunting. I don't know how many birds they can take, but oh my gosh, there's just so much on the landscape that makes it so hard for these birds.
And you guys asked some really great questions. It really helped break up the monotony of me reading my notes. The other sign of hope is that they're experimenting with technology. If you guys ever had a dog, they have these virtual fences now. You have like a collar on the dog, and you can set up the boundary of the fence so it doesn't leave your yard. Well, they're experimenting on that with cows, and obviously they have to use a much larger transmitter over a much larger area than your backyard, but they are looking at ways to make these virtual fences so that you can manage cows much easier than having the cowboy go out there and chase them around. That's expensive. You only have so many cowboys, and there's so many more cows that they're experimenting on in my area on some BLM land where there are sage-grouse in terms of trying to use this virtual fence technology to herd cows in a much more efficient manner than people. So we're going to hopefully that gives us some signs of life, some hope as well.
Wow, all just incredible, interesting facts, and your knowledge is quite extensive on sage-grouse. So thanks again. Really enjoyed it. Everyone, give them a high five or a clap.
Yes. Awesome.
So anyway, Brian, thanks again. Good night, everyone. We'll see you next month. We're going to have someone from Audubon, California, and he's actually going to drive to Chico. So he'll be here at Chico Creek Nature Center. All right. Good night, everyone.